All right, we're going to be in Galatians 1, and we'll be studying in verses 11 to 24. I wanted to say something before I get started. It appears as though last week while I was teaching, I was over there, there was a little baby snake that crawled across, and I actually watched the video this week of the class, crawled across and kind of went right behind me, and then there was a shot where he was kind of between my legs. And my sweet wife saw it and texted me, but I didn't understand what her text was because it just said snakes, had a bunch of snakes on it. So I have told you guys before, I feel like one of the marks that we know each other well is if I were to get up and preach and my fly was undone, that I knew somebody would tell me. Okay, let's just say that's double for snakes. If you see a snake, class is dismissed. We'll do something else. I am not a snake guy. So if you see any snakes, baby, mama, whatever, I don't care. Let me know, please, about that. Don't bother texting me. Just tell me. I'm right here. Okay. Galatians 1. We're going to be covering the second half of Galatians 1. And just to remind you a little bit of where we are in the letter, this is a letter that Paul has written because he's concerned about things that are being taught in these churches in Galatia about how they need to add sort of the Judaizing elements, the idea of being circumcised and keeping the Torah that has been added to their faith in Jesus. And so Paul is answering those accusations. In the first part, you remember he's been arguing anyone who preaches a different gospel than what he preached in the beginning should be accursed. He says that twice. And then in verse 10, he talks about, I'm not seeking the approval of man, or I'm not serving or trying to please man, but God. So I want you to notice in Paul's thinking, it's very binary at this point. It's either from man or from God. We're either pleasing man or pleasing God. And that's going to be important for this section because he's going to focus on the origin of his teaching, and he's going to argue, as he does there in verse 11, that the gospel he preaches is not from man, but from God. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read verses 11 to 17. We'll jump through that, and then we'll just kind of, there's a little bit of a break in thought there, and we'll kind of stop there and get some questions, comments. Verse 11, For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the tradition of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Okay, so you see his thesis, and Paul is sometimes really good about this, other times he's not as good about stating his thesis clearly. Verse 11 is a clear thesis, and it's really going to explain everything we're going to talk about tonight, that he says the gospel is not in any way human. That is, it's not something that Paul came up with, nor is it something that Paul got from some other man, even the apostles. This is not something that has human origins at all, nor was it even transmitted by man. So this is the accusation, it seems to me, that he is answering, is probably something along this line, that the Judaizing teachers are saying, Paul came to you, and he preached the gospel. You guys were Gentiles. It was a stretch just for you to understand who Jesus is and the idea of the Messiah. And so he said, you guys are doing enough just to believe in Jesus. You don't need to worry about, I'm just going to leave off the part about circumcision and keeping the law and all of that. I'm going to make it easier for you. And so that was Paul's amendment to the gospel. And I think that's probably what they're saying Paul was teaching. And so Paul says here, this is not something that I came up with. It's not something that I abridged. This is instead exactly what Jesus called me to teach and taught me himself, what he revealed to me. So there is a reason he's going to argue that this is not human, but I think it means both this is not from him or is it from some other person. You remember back in verse 1, he said, I'm an apostle not from men nor through man. So Paul doesn't claim to be an apostle because the other apostles gave him the power laid hands on him or anything like that. He claims to be an apostle because Jesus called him directly and appeared to him and revealed his will to him and sent him as an apostle to the Gentiles. Okay, this may have been the accusation of the Judaizers about Paul's Torah-free gospel. That's what I'm talking about. Paul was preaching this because he came up with it. It's something that he got. And so what Paul's going to do is detail his conversion and his travel to prove this statement. So this is one of those sections where if you're one of the Bible nerds, you get all excited and you're like, oh, good, we get to read, what did Paul do? Where did he go? When was he here? What was he thinking? And then there are other people who read this and they think, oh, man, why are we talking about Paul's travel plans? That's kind of boring. Okay, please know this is not about getting the Bible trivia questions right. This part is about Paul's argument that this gospel is not from man. So all his travel stuff is intended to convince us that I didn't come up with this on my own, nor did I go get it from the apostles. Verse 12, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. That word receive, where he says, I did not receive it from any man, is a technical term for the transmission of tradition. You might remember this from the account in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul says, I delivered to you what I received, talking about the tradition of the Lord's Supper and the Last Supper and what Jesus said. Or in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about the gospel that I received, and he talks about that Christ, was died for our sins, was buried, and was raised from the dead according to the Scriptures. These are things he says I received. So when he says it that way, he's saying I didn't come up with this in that context, but instead this is what we all understand. This is the tradition we believe. So here, it's an interesting idea because Paul says, I didn't receive my gospel from anyone else. It's not a tradition I got. I didn't go up to Jerusalem and sit at the feet of the apostles, say, teach me, what's the gospel? Instead, Jesus appeared to me and I started preaching it because Jesus taught me what I needed to know. I didn't receive it from any man. So the central elements of Paul's teaching don't come from the other apostles. And I think we need to say, I don't think that means that Paul didn't learn anything from the other apostles or that Paul doesn't have any connection with the other apostles. His argument here is, I didn't get it from them, but instead what Jesus revealed directly to me, he'll talk about this in chapter 2, was in perfect agreement with what they knew from Jesus. So, but that's not how it worked. It didn't work where they heard it and then they told me, they got it, I got it, and then we compared notes and they were the same. So that just shows that both of us were following Jesus, but independently following Jesus. Yep, I already said that. Okay, verse 13. Verse 13, for you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. I do think it's powerful to hear from Paul's own mouth how he was thinking, what he was doing, and what he did. But he says he's going to do a before and after thing. You remember what I was before, and then when Jesus appeared to me, this is what I became. And the before and after picture shows that something had to change. What is it that made Paul go from who he was to who he became? Because it was a complete 180 in terms of his attitude toward Jesus and toward Jesus' people. So the argument is something miraculous must have happened. There had to be something. It wasn't that Paul just came to a different conclusion and started doing differently, because what he was doing before was so filled with zeal and rage that something had to stop it. Something had to change it. Something had to transform it into what it became. He says in verse 13, you've heard of my former life in Judaism. And that's interesting because he also says Judaism in verse 14. I was advancing in Judaism. And that idea is, it implies a belief system that he is no longer a part of. This is interesting. Because what are these teachers saying? They're saying that you Gentiles kind of need to become Jews. You kind of need to join Judaism. Paul says, I was the star of the show in Judaism. But something changed where I no longer am in Judaism. So he says, I'm no longer a part of that. This is who I was. You've heard of my former life in Judaism, he says. And this is who I used to be in Judaism. But now I'm something different. I'm no longer a part of that. In fact, he's going to talk about, we'll talk about this in chapter 6, the Israel of God, which is his way of describing the church, God's people now. And he says, that's different from who I used to be. So Judaism is who I used to be. Israel of God is who I am now. But a change happened as I went along with that. So Gentiles, your goal is not just to be a part of Judaism. That's what I left behind. And I don't want you to be added to what I left behind. That wouldn't make any sense for either of us. And he says in verse 13, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. Paul was zealous for Judaism. He talks about persecuting the church violently. And then in verse 14, he says, I was so extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. So you've got both the negative and the positive there, right? The negative is I was so zealous that I was going to punish those who were teaching what was wrong. But I was also exceedingly zealous for the traditions. I was passionate about what made us Jews, all those dividing lines, the distinctiveness of the Jewish people, keeping covenant, circumcision, kosher laws, worshiping just the true God, no idols, no compromise. That's who I was. This is what we did. I was a Jew of Jews, a Hebrew of Hebrews. And so I was passionate about that. And then when there came along this group who believed that the Messiah had come, and they started saying things that kind of took the focus away from the temple and the focus away from the Torah, that bothered me. And it made me violently zealous. So a lot of the commentators will talk about how in the Maccabean period, the period between the Old and New Testaments, the Jews were so aggressive and began to fight back against the Romans and the Antiochus Epiphanes, the Syrian leaders that were there in charge of the land of Israel. And as they fought back, they would cite people like Phinehas from the Old Testament. Phinehas, who had such zeal that he kills someone who is committing fornication with one of the Moabite women. Or the other one, I'm drawing a blank. It will come to me in just a second. No, it's not coming to me. Snake. Oh, Elijah on Mount Carmel. Elijah on Mount Carmel. Remember, Elijah on Mount Carmel says, let's seize the prophets of Baal and kill them. Okay, and they do. And so there's a zeal there, right? And you can look at those Old Testament examples and say, look, this is what God's people do when God's people are threatened or when people are doing evil. And so Paul may be like that, thinking, these are my examples. This is who I want to be. Or like the people in the Maccabean period. So he is zealous. He is passionate. That's who I was, he says. Verse 15. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me or in me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. All right, so God had a special mission for Paul from the womb. He says that in verse 15. Set me apart before I was born, calling him to a certain role, which reminds us of Isaiah and Jeremiah, who both say that God called them from their mother's womb. And then he says in verse 16, he was pleased to reveal his Son to me or in me, to call me to this work. So that's Paul sees himself as a pivotal figure because he has received this special revelation from Jesus. He has seen the Lord on the road to Damascus. One purpose of this revelation, and he says that specifically in verse 16, he was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Paul is supposed to, God's will for Paul is to go preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Paul knows, being the good Pharisee that he is, that there are so many passages about God bringing the Gentiles in during the time of the Messiah. This was God's will from long ago. Now, a lot of the Jewish people in the in-between period didn't care so much for that idea, and they kind of downplayed it. But this was, Paul knew this, and Paul says, I'm evidently the guy. Jesus called me, and in the accounts in Acts of Paul saying, this is what happened when I heard the Lord. Jesus tells him specifically, you are going to go to the Gentiles. Do you remember it causes a riot in the temple when he says that in Acts 22? So Paul knows this is what Jesus wants from me. Not all the Jews are obliging to that, but Paul says this is why I was set apart from my mother's womb. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is my goal. What's he doing in Galatia then? He comes to Galatia to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, to bring the Gentiles in like God had always said. Now, this is just my question. That's why I put it in parentheses. Would it make sense for God to call Paul to this work, but not teach him what he needed to know to do it? Paul, go preach to the Gentiles. Good luck figuring out what you're supposed to preach. No, Jesus gives him what he needs to do it. So think about what is being said here. That Paul is saying, I came to you on a mission direct from Jesus. Do you think I got it wrong? Do you think I botched it? Didn't teach the right things? Abridged the message? Jesus told him what he needed to know. All right, verse 16. Then he says, he was pleased to reveal his Son in me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So, Paul doesn't visit the apostles or present himself as their student. I want you to think about what you might think. If you were to say, here is a brand new convert. He has become a believer in Jesus. Now, he's a Pharisee. He knows the law pretty well. But doesn't he need to be taught? Remember what happens in Acts 2? On the day of Pentecost, 3,000 are saved. And then what do? They continued steadfastly in the apostles' teaching. They wanted to learn from the apostles. Where are you going to go to learn about Jesus? The guys that were with Jesus. They know Jesus. They know what he taught. They know who he is. And now they have the Holy Spirit. You're going to go see them. But he says, I did not go present them as a student for them. I didn't need to learn from them. I didn't consult with anyone. That wasn't what I did. I went to Arabia and then back to Damascus. So if you're keeping track, let me speak to, I suspect I have some Bible nerds in my audience. If you're keeping track, you're in Acts 9 where Paul is converted and he is in Damascus. Okay, and then he goes away into Arabia. This is a period not recorded in Acts. And then comes back to where he was in Damascus. And then in Acts 9, he is kind of barely escapes from Damascus, is let down the wall in a basket, and runs off to Jerusalem. Paul tells us here in his own words that this is 3 years later. But you get his point. Please don't miss it for all the Bible nerding. Okay, please don't miss it. The point is, I didn't go talk to them. I didn't need their information or validation. I was preaching what Jesus taught me to preach. All right. Comments, questions? Ms. Trish, go ahead.
Of all the apostles, Paul might have been the only one that could have come up with the doctrine on his own without God's help, perhaps. Only because he was so familiar with the Old Testament and the many, as you said, prophecies that the Gentiles would be added to God's people. Not that he could do it by himself, but he was the only one that had the knowledge, that perhaps had a clue what he was going to have to do and what he was going to face.
Right. No one accused Peter of making up the teaching, right? And I think probably that has to do with their backgrounds. Paul is very different from the other apostles in terms of his education and especially the law type things about his education. Yeah, Brother Jim?
Well, I read or heard, I don't remember which, and it's been several years, but that while Paul was in Arabia, and it's kind of confusing here, it appears he was there for a period of about 3 years. During this 3-year period, he received revelations from Jesus concerning what he was to teach. And then, of course, when he came back, that's when he started his ministry, I guess you call it. I don't know if that's...
It's possible.
It's possible,
It's possible. There's sort of we don't really know what was going on. I think there is a tradition that he was out praying and receiving things. I don't know if that's true. There is at least an implication in my mind that he is preaching. Because when he comes back, like in Acts 9, he is preaching in Damascus. And then they're going to say in verse 23, the Christians in Jerusalem, he's preaching the faith he tried to destroy. But so I always assume that's what he's doing in Arabia, but I don't know. And I don't know if it was, he sees Jesus and he's zapped with some kind of, that's all the information he needs then. I don't know how that works. I've never had that happen, so I'm just going to say he knew what was happening better than I do. But yeah, that's possible that's what's happening while he's in Arabia.
Well, I think when you say he went to Arabia, too, there's no way that he could be near Jerusalem or Samaria where all this is going on, where Peter and the rest of the apostles are.
Right.
So he's not in Galilee. He's in a completely different area.
Right.
So he could not be with the apostles. And also, he says, reveal his son to me. Well, that shows you God himself wanted Paul to know about his son too. And then you go to Acts 26 where Christ says that he told Paul that you're going to the Gentiles and you're going to open their eyes that they may turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, and that they may receive forgiveness of sins, the very thing Paul preached to them. And now they want to question him.
Right.
He's saying, well, actually, mine came directly from God himself. It did not have anything to do with me.
Right. He was commissioned directly, go do this. Then when he does it, they are questioning him about it, which you can see the frustration that would create in him. All right, other comments, questions? Okay, so we are in verse 18. It says, Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remain with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They were only hearing it said, He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorify God because of me. All right, so Paul says specifically in verse 18, we're 3 years later, so somehow in this time in Arabia and Damascus, 3 years have passed since he first saw Jesus, that first Damascus road experience. He goes, he says, to visit Cephas, to visit, and the word here is interesting. One scholar said it means to make his acquaintance. So it's a little different than the I'm going to go beg for his approval type thing, but visit is much more of a co-equal type relationship. I think this has to be Acts 9, where Paul goes from Damascus to Jerusalem. And remember, this is where it says they did not believe he was a disciple because they were afraid of him. And then Barnabas kind of vouches for him, and he goes in and goes in and out among them. But there is an implication there because of the opposition of the Jews that there's not a lot of time he's there. And so they send him off to Tarsus at that point. So I think that's what we're talking about here. Let me just say this. If you read it closely, you might come up with a seeming contradiction, which is in Acts 9, it says that Barnabas brought him to the apostles, plural. And here he says, I didn't see any of the apostles except Peter, and he's going to talk about James. We'll mention him in a minute. So I think that this may be one of those where he meets with some of the apostles and not others. It may be that he doesn't have an in-depth conversation with all of the apostles, maybe just with Cephas and with James. But I think there is enough leeway there, especially given the fact that this is Paul's own firsthand account, to be able to say there must be something more to this story than just what it appears on the surface of Acts 9. So, but I do think we're reading the account from Paul's perspective of what Acts 9 looks like. The reason he mentions 15 days in verse 18 with Peter, I think, is important because it's just not enough time. That's what he's saying. I was only there 15 days. So it wasn't like I was there for 2 or 3 years and I learned at their feet and I followed them around and they laid hands on me and all of these kinds of things. Instead, I was just there, kind of said hello, kind of met some of the people, but didn't have the kind of relationship that would indicate I'm beholden to them in some way. Verse 19, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, and what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. So he says, I also saw James, Jesus' brother. He is called an apostle. I think it's possible this is a non-technical use of apostle. Sometimes we get kind of wrapped around the axle about the word apostle, because you remember in Acts 1, after Judas has died, They make a big speech. Peter makes a big speech about we need an apostle, and it needs to be somebody who's been with us through all these things and has witnessed to the resurrection. It's a very technical way of using apostle. But sometimes apostle just kind of means one sent out, and it's less technical. And so I put Acts 14:14, where he talks about the apostles, Barnabas and Paul. I think that there are some times where it's just talking about the guys that were sent out, the ones that are on a mission, which Barnabas and Paul were in Acts 14. And I think that's probably James's use here. I don't think that they thought of him as an apostle as in the original 12, but I think it's something else, something that has to do with status, or something that has to do with his importance as Jesus' brother and his importance in the church in Jerusalem. But I did want to point out that Paul uses an oath form in verse 20, before God I do not lie. There must be something here. Why would Paul go on and on about this? I think it has to be some argument that the teachers in Galatia are making against Paul. So let me try to give you my best shot at what I think the argument might be. I think it's probably something like this. Paul is sort of a Johnny-come-lately apostle. And Paul needed to be taught some things and needed to be straightened out by the other apostles. And Paul still doesn't have all his facts straight, but the apostles are trying to rein him in as best they can. But Paul had to go learn from them, and now here he is. He's trying to kind of make it work as one of the subordinates of the real apostles. And we, meanwhile, us Judaizing teachers, we come from Jerusalem. And we have the imprimatur of the real apostles. In fact, I know that's happening because when you get into Acts 15, that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying, we come from Jerusalem, and these men need to be circumcised to be saved. And Paul and Barnabas get so frustrated about that, they go up to Jerusalem and meet with the apostles and the elders there, basically saying, did you guys say this? And are you sending these men out to preach this? And you remember in the letter that goes out in Acts 15, the apostles and elders say, we gave no such commandment. We didn't do it. So they had to be saying they had given this commandment. And I think that's probably part of what they're causing trouble for Paul about. So Paul is saying, look, I swear I'm not lying. I am telling the truth about what I did and my movements. I am not beholden to the apostles. Verse 21, then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, which agrees, by the way, with the account in Acts. That's where Antioch and Tarsus were, Acts 9:30, Acts 11:25. This is where he goes. And that's also true in Acts. So verse 22, I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. So the people in Jerusalem didn't even know me. They didn't even know my face. I wasn't even around them enough for them to recognize me. You guys know sometimes we'll have people who visit our congregation, and you see them once or you see them twice. But sometimes if people visit for a month, you recognize them. Okay, it takes a little while. Paul says, I wasn't even there long enough for people to know who I was. So they, instead of knowing me by sight, and the verse 22 says by face, it says verse 23, they were only hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. So some of them talked about me, but they didn't all know me because I wasn't even there long enough to be known. Again, he is arguing that this is not the way this all worked. The only thing is, verse 23, they were only hearing it said, he used to persecute us. He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorify God because of me. So the only thing he points out is they were thrilled to hear that Paul had changed, and so they glorified God because of that. So there's Paul's defense, at least this part of it. He's going to keep going into his movements in chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 2 to describe what came next, but we're going to leave it off here and try to draw some lessons and applications from this. Any comments or questions about the text that we've been covering? Ms. Trish?
Paul goes out of his way to talk about his former life. And I think it would be like you or Brother Curtis converting, if she was still alive, Madeline Murray O'Hare. That's a big deal. And for Paul, it was a big deal that he had made a complete turnaround. And that was something he had to live with, the fact that he had persecuted and killed so many Christians thinking he was doing the right thing.
I think there is an importance in not just the change, but as regards this discussion in Galatians about the law. Because it's not as if Paul is a law hater. Paul has spent his whole life loving the law, honoring the law, zealous for the law. And now he is saying, you don't have to keep the law to be saved. And that's a big deal too, isn't it? Just as much as going from persecuting to loving, so going from upholding the law and encouraging everyone to keep it to now saying, this is not the key to being saved. There's a transformation there. And if one part of it is from Jesus and we're going to glorify God because of the one part, how can we not recognize the other parts from Jesus and glorify God for that too? All right, other comments, questions? All right, here's my question. I have some answers, and again, I don't want you to think we're playing guess what the teacher is thinking. I don't like that game. Plus, I think weird, so you're probably not going to guess what I'm thinking. Because I'm probably thinking about, are there any snakes up here? But here is my question. Why does the origin of a teaching matter? Paul goes on and on about this. Why?
Well, it's about the integrity of the gospel.
How?
It's represented to be truth, and so the one that has it needs to know where it comes from and able to defend it from where he got it. So I think that's what's important to Paul, and what he's saying is, I got it from Revelation, and that means it was uncovered for me. That's the same word the title of the last book is. It's an uncovering.
Right.
And so what he did with it was announce it. He presented what he had heard. And the idea of, I wasn't taught it, they didn't teach me how to do this. What he was able to do because of the teachers that he had in the school that he'd been to, he knew the Old Testament scriptures. So then he heard the words of Christ and was able to compare that to find that it was the truth. So I think the 14 years is subsumed in the fact that he spent a good deal of time thinking about what he already knew and what he had come to know.
Mm-hmm. So there's a truth claim. It's part of what you're saying, and as a truth claim, there's an integrity issue. If we claim something is true, but it's not from God, it's from us. So we have a responsibility. If I'm going to claim something is true, then I kind of have to answer the question, is it true because I came up with it, or is it true because it's from some other source, right? So there's some, I agree with you, there's an integrity thing, but there's some depth to that as we keep kind of going back behind that. Steve, you had?
It's very important for the origin of the gospel, because it seems like every single time man always seems to commit errors. We always seem to, man is not God. I mean, man was created by God, but man is not God. And we human beings are prone to making mistakes and messing up on the teaching and the principles therein. Yeah.
That's I've been reading in Genesis lately, and it's just that pattern. God gives something and then man messes it up. And that's just sort of the pattern of human existence. So if we're talking about an origin of a teaching, then we don't want to trust and depend on man, because man is fallible, man can be wrong. Yeah.
So that was the first point that I was going to make, that God is infallible, man is fallible. And then to go further on that is that the people that are accusing him, Judaizing Christians that are saying this, it's giving credibility to it, because the law came from God. So if he's saying what I'm telling you also came from God, then in their minds, that's giving credibility to his message. It's not me. It's the same God that gave you this law is now saying to do this.
Right. So if you're going to argue God has changed something, God has the right to say, let's change the rules. Let's do something different, or let's fulfill this word with a different word. But we don't have the right to say, you know what, let's ignore what God said. Yeah, let's change God's rules for him. So if there's an authority claim there because something is moving, yeah. We got.
I was just going to say, and as we very recently just studied, if anybody preaches any other gospel than the one that I've preached to you, let him be accursed.
Right.
So you have to know the origin in order to know if it's real.
Yeah, to know should we believe this person or not? Should we accept this message or not? There are things we know that are true, and then there are things that are suspect, especially if they diverge from what's true. Yeah, Brother Jim?
Well, it speaks to the authenticity of the teaching. I think that's why Paul started his chapter by saying, I'm amazed that y'all have so quickly turned to another gospel, a gospel that's not really a gospel. It's from man, and what I am preaching and teaching to you is from God.
Right. So it's not something that is even a gospel because it can't save you. It's just man's thinking. Who we got? Brother Phil?
The origin of a teaching matters because there is only one origin. And especially in today's world, we have a lot of teachings that don't come from that one true origin.
Right. Right. Only one that's valid, that's worth considering, following. Do you have somebody else, Lane? Okay. Any other answers? I like the thoughts. I think it's good to think, why does this matter so much? I think it's important to say, do you remember Jesus saying this? By what authority? They ask him, by what authority do you do these things? And he says, the baptism of John. Where did it come from? Heaven, from man. And I said in the beginning of the class, Paul's thinking is binary. It's one or the other. And I think we need that because we need to remember, just like Phil said, there's one source that we can trust and know and follow and say, this is true and good and right always. And then there is every other source, which includes you and me. If we're coming up with something, if we're thinking our way into something, logicking our way into something, that's not the same as saying this is from God. And that difference, I think we need to be able to see, because that's the way Paul is thinking. The problem here is not just that I don't agree with your theology. The problem is what you're teaching is not originating with God. Yep.
I was thinking of this throughout the week, and then I was recalling the 4th chapter of the book of Ephesians. And this is the same person who is now recounting where he gets his message, and the book of Ephesians tells us in explicit terms what that means and how authentic it was. So I was just thinking, just step by step, and it puts it all together.
Yep. It becomes here's your record of, like Jim said, authenticity. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that came to me last week and again this week is to remember that when Peter's sermon on Pentecost in Acts 2, he recites that David had said the stone that the builders had rejected. He goes to Psalms 118, and he brings that in, and where David says, open to me the gates of righteousness that I may enter into them. And And then he makes the statement about righteousness. And that whole psalm is quoted in, not whole psalm, the part of that psalm that is quoted in Acts 2 that Peter makes. Peter calls David a prophet at that point about those words. And then again, Peter uses that in Acts 4 to those that he has been put in prison by. The point is that the only argument that could be made to the Jews was that somebody like David, a prophet, could say this about Judaism, that what's going to happen to the law. There's going to be a change. Paul's dealing with that in the everyday as he's teaching and preaching. And obviously the Holy Spirit has set this up. God has set this up in both prophecy, in the Psalms, and from David so that the Jews could be convinced.
Right.
That's a lot of the things that are always going on in Scripture is what Paul knew before he became a Christian and what Paul taught when he became a Christian. It's pretty much important, I think.
There's a lot of meat on that bone that I won't be able to get to tonight, but I'm thinking about the veil that lies on their hearts as they read, that keeps them from seeing that maybe that is what Paul had to see Jesus in order to be able to see. So here is what I had. The origin of a teaching matters because men can be wrong. We covered that. Revelation, not logic, is the only way to know God's mind or will. I cite 1 Corinthians 2. No one knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man who's in him. And God has given to us his things because he's given to us his spirit. So he has revealed himself to us. I say not logic because it's important for us to know we can't think our way to God and we can't think our way to truth. That's not the way truth works. That's not the way God has wired us or the world. So we need to know that something does come from God. We can only know God and please God by doing God's will for us. And that kind of goes back to this. How do we know God's will? He has to tell us. So we need to know what has God said, and then that's how we know God. We don't know God by our own ingenuity. We don't know God by living life. We don't know God by observing nature. We know pieces about God that can only be understood and interpreted when we understand what God actually revealed. And we can only please God when we do God's will. We can only know God's will when God reveals God's will. It's all pretty simple, but I think we need to state it clearly because Paul is not wasting words. Paul has a point to make, and it's that this stuff matters. Where this comes from matters. I want to spend just a moment on applications. I've got 4 of them, and I've got a minute, so let's go fast. First, people can change. Paul changes. People can't change. I'm not talking about, as you get older, you mellow out. I'm talking about people can change radically because God is at work in their lives, because the gospel of Christ touches their hearts, because God is working. That's what happens with Paul. He becomes a completely different person. You've heard of my former life. Now look at what I am now. Zeal doesn't make us right. Paul was extremely zealous and extremely wrong. He was running 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction. And God had to turn him around. So it is great. I love it when I see people who are zealous, especially when they're zealous for good things. But just because you're zealous doesn't mean you're right. And sometimes it's important for us to be able to distinguish those two and say, hey, I love your enthusiasm. Let's talk a little about that. Think about Apollos in Acts 18. Fervent in spirit, but needed to be shown the way of God more accurately. We should glorify God for what he's doing in the lives of others and our own. I love how the people in Judea, it says in verse 24 there, glorify God because of me. Are we glorifying God? When we see good things going on, when we see growth, when we see change, we see positive things, do we give God praise? And it might even be encouraging to the person to say, I'm praising God because of you. I see God at work in your life. And then to also see it in our own lives. The fourth is this: God has revealed his love and will to us. I need to trust it, and I need to follow him. So he has shown us how he feels and what he wants, and now I have a responsibility. What am I going to do? Who am I going to be as a result of that? All right, thanks so much for your attention. We'll pick up there in chapter 2, Lord willing, next week.